Memory corridors are one of the most distinctive parts of Assassin's Creed. You've just dealt a killing blow on your target, and suddenly time freezes. Or does it? The guards who were seconds away from gutting you politely stand back, and you and your target have an oddly calm, heartfelt conversation, sometimes while they're literally bleeding out. For a long time, there's been questions whether this makes sense in universe, or if it's just a gameplay mechanic that's, disguised as lore. According to Darby McDevitt, these aren't meant to be literal moments where the assassin chats with their target's ghost. Since the very first game, there's been a dramatization of the assassin's internal thoughts, so pretty much a symbolic space inside the protagonist's mind where they process the kill, where they confront the target's motives and then reflect on their own. So those memory corridors are really more about storytelling than physical reality. The only real exception is Assassin's Creed Unity, which plays by its own bizarre rules that nobody knows how. Earlier games had assassinations and escape sequences that felt earned, while the later games sometimes leaned into the drama over realism. Of course, the franchise has always played with memory and the Animus's interpretation of history. Whether you see them as literal moments, symbolic exchanges, or Animus glitches, memory corridors have delivered some of the most memorable scenes in the franchise. So in this video, I'll be ranking the memory corridors from each game to see which one of these games delivers them the best. Now do note, this is not including the loading screen memory corridors, but just the death confession memory corridors. Oh, and this video is not a ranking of every individual memory corridor, otherwise I would be here for hours. This is just which game does them the best. So without further ado, let's get into it. In last place, we have two games combined, Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Assassin's Creed Shadows. The reason for this is because, these two games have no memory corridors. Well, unless you count the modern day in Shadows, but that's a stretch. So thank you Ubisoft Quebec, thanks a lot. Moving on from that travesty, we now have another travesty, and that is the memory corridors in Assassin's Creed Unity. Okay, maybe the word travesty is a bit harsh, it's more disappointing. I say this because the memory corridors in Unity are such a departure from what came before that they feel disconnected from the franchise's normal rhythm. Instead of the traditional face-to-face moments we get in most Assassin's Creed games, Unity introduces Arno's bizarre ability to see fragments of his target's memories. I guess Arno's above average concentration of ezio DNA is the reason he's able to see these memories, but I don't know how I feel about that low explanation. But as for the actual memory corridors itself, it's not the best. The execution is inconsistent, and for me, it robs the scenes of the emotional weight found in most memory corridors. Without that verbal back and forth between the assassin and the target, I feel like we lose that personality clash, and we never really know the kind of last words they tell. Essentially, it just forgets what a memory corridor is supposed to even be, and for that reason, Unity lands here in the video. This one is an interesting one because Assassin's Creed Liberation does a fine job at containing memory corridors, but the visual side of it and the lack of interesting targets is a reason why it's here in the video. So for this one, it's definitely different, as there seems to be more than just white and grey on the screen, which is quite rare in memory corridors. The ones in Liberation are a very in-your-face orange and light blue with a ton of lens flare. It's definitely different, and honestly it gives me stronger old handheld vibes, which is quite fitting since the game originally released on the PlayStation Vita. Now, I think these shapes and colors reflect the fact that within the lore, Assassin's Creed Liberation is actually a game within a game, and it's a public Animus experience developed by Abstergo Entertainment. I mean, when you boot the game up, you know that. Now, from a design standpoint, the constant blobs of color just feel out of place during what should be, those reflective, introspective moments. Lens flare works best when tied to an actual light source, not just thrown in for visual flair. Here, they can end up distracting the weight of the scene rather than improving it. I will say though, Liberation's memory corridors do deserve credit for fitting neatly into the game's meta-narrative and, for trying something fresh with the presentation. But unfortunately, the trade-off is a lack of emotional moments and that grounded atmosphere. The qualities that make the best memory corridors so memorable. It's like the game is saying, here's your dramatic death scene, but let's splash some bright blobs of color behind it so it feels less impactful. Oh, now this one might be a hot take, and as somebody that adores Assassin's Creed Revelations as a game, I find its memory corridors and animus related color theme to be not all that. It's quite generic, but I will say in terms of the tone it tries to portray, it's not that bad. It's very dark and depressing, and it does a decent job showing us that, especially as it kind of fits with the atmosphere of Ezio and even Altair's more reflective stages in life. The problem is that while the colors work, the rest of the presentation feels a bit tacky. It's just black lines moving up and down. There is nothing particularly interesting to notice. You know, there's no distinct flair that makes it feel special or tailored to Revelation's setting. Other Assassin's Creed games that went with darker corridors managed to make them feel more textured or even lived in, as you will see later on with the more recent games. Here, it's more like a stripped down version of what came before. That said, not all is lost. One standout moment for me is the memory corridor with Abbas Sophian. This scene fits the tone of the corridor perfectly. Seeing an older Altair appear in that moment was incredibly fitting, especially tying the series past and present together. So yeah, mixed bag on this one. The darker color tone is a welcome change, but you know, most of the time the minimal background feels uninspired, making these corridors functional but far from the most memorable in the franchise. Now next up we have Assassin's Creed Syndicate's memory corridors. Now just note from this point on, there are no bad memory corridors at all. In fact, it's hard to find flaws with them, but I have to rank them, so that's what I'm going to do. One thing that stood out to me in Syndicate is that most targets remain standing and speaking normally during their final moments. It's a noticeable change, though I personally prefer when targets are shown lying down and visibly wounded, as it feels more true to what's actually happening in the scene. Visually, the design is good. The floor is made up of square tiles that rise and fall as if they're floating, almost giving the impression that the ground itself is breathing, which is admittedly a strange analogy, but hey, it fits. The surrounding grey clouds complement the time period's depressing industrial atmosphere, adding a touch of moodiness to the space. I also appreciate that it still clearly feels like an animus environment, yet it has enough structure and physicality to give the illusion that the targets and you are walking on something tangible instead of just hovering in a void. If anything, it mixes that simulation feel with just enough realism to keep you immersed. Oh, and while it's not part of the main game, I do have to mention the memory corridor at the end of the Dreadful Crimes DLC. It's absolute perfection. Walking through it while things just load in around you is such a great touch, but since that's the DLC and not the base game, I'll just leave that there and move on. Okay, now here we are with another controversial choice, and this one is both Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood's memory corridors. Now, even though Assassin's Creed 2 is my favorite game in the franchise, I'm not an idiot to just place everything Ezio related as number 1 and call it a day, although I am a bit tempted to. Nah, I'm just kidding. I like to be fair. Now, the reason I placed these two at the same placement is because, their memory corridors are essentially the same thing with very minimal differences. These two games are arguably the definitive image that pops into your head when you think of memory corridors, right? It's just an endless white void with thin lines shifting all around you. In fact, I don't even think there's a flaw. It's just the same all around you. What really sells the vibe for me is how the targets behave here. After Ezio makes a kill, I like that they don't stand around or struggle, but instead the camera slowly rotates around the target that's laying on the floor. I also find it interesting that sometimes the animus even bends the rules, placing two targets together for the conversation, despite them dying at different times in the story. I don't think that's ever been done before or been done after. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood keeps the same basic look but plays around with the tone of the scenes. I do find it a bit of a letdown that there are main story Templar targets in Brotherhood that don't even speak, but instead it's just Ezio saying a few words and closing the target's eyes. Now, while later games would experiment with more color and, the atmosphere, the Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood corridor design is still memorable for its simplicity. It strips away any distractions, and it leaves you alone with the target in a space that's clearly not real, which works perfectly for what the memory corridor is meant to be. Now, this is an underrated one if anything. First of all, Assassin's Creed Rogue is probably the least played game in the franchise, and so naturally the memory corridors are by definition underrated. I like them a lot. Right away, the deep navy blue color scheme sets a very consistent and perfectly suited to the North Atlantic setting tone. Now to me, I look at this blue color scheme as, not a random color choice, but one that evokes the cold, unforgiving nature of Shay's world and this game's theme. One of my favorite parts of Rogue's corridor design is the wave effect. The floor uses a checkered crosshatch pattern that does a fantastic job distorting up and down, creating the illusion of an ocean swell beneath your feet. It's a very small detail, but I think it's measurable mesmerizing, and it makes the corridors feel alive in a way that connects them to the game's seafaring theme. One interesting thing I've noticed is that there's even a few times where the target actually interacts with the memory corridor itself. For example, take Laverin Dreyer's memory corridor. He even leans on a digital version of his ship, since that's where we killed him as Shay. I thought that's a nice touch. On top of that, the triangular floor tiles, which I think is borrowed from Assassin's Creed 3, shift and rearrange as you move, which adds a nice clean aesthetic. The presentation is already strong, but what really makes it even better is how much each one of these memory corridors means narratively. Nearly every target we assassinate in this game was once an ally of Shay, or deeply connected to his character. That personal history gives each memory corridor encounter weight, like the conversations feel loaded with so much emotion. So for a shorter, often overlooked entry, Assassin's Creed Rogue's memory corridors are surprisingly good, both visually and narratively, and they've stuck with me for quite a long time after finishing the game. Now we move on to one of the most unique sets of memory corridors in the whole franchise, and that is Assassin's Creed Mirage. It's not what you'd normally expect from Assassin's Creed, but for the story this game is trying to tell, I think the memory corridors work really well. Now this game takes a very different approach with its corridors, leaning heavily into a supernatural tone that sets it apart from the rest of the series. After each assassination, instead of the normal calm conversation, we see the appearance of a djinn, which is a shadowy otherworldly figure that looms over the moment right after Basim swipes the feather in the target's blood. It's definitely intended to be creepy on purpose, and it fits perfectly with Basim's whole low-key and split personality storyline. The visual design matches this tone. The corridors are kind of bathed in deep shadows with a dark grainy floor and a very dark orange sky that almost feels oppressive. What really stands out to me the most though, and I don't think it's been done before or something similar, is the ghostly figures in the background. They look like human silhouettes, and while I'm not sure exactly what they mean in the story, I like them a lot. Maybe they're meant to be mirages since the game takes place in a desert. You know, this darker style makes me think about what Assassin's Creed Hexe might do with its memory corridors. That game is already said to be the creepiest and most unsettling in the franchise, so maybe we'll see them push even further into horror territory instead of just giving us small hints like Mirage does. If you're somebody that got into this franchise with the RPG games, you'd probably place Assassin's Creed Valhalla's memory corridors as the number one, and I mean that's fair enough, I can see why. It's visually and narratively incredible, especially for the whole Eivor and Odin theme that Valhalla goes for. I am quite curious though, why aren't Valhalla's memory corridor scenes talked about more? I feel like the dynamic between Eivor and Odin combined with the cinematic presentation was fantastic. When people bring up the best confession scenes in Assassin's Creed, you often hear three games: Assassin's Creed 1, Assassin's Creed 3, and Assassin's Creed Origins. I mean, that's a spoiler for what's up ahead, but Valhalla absolutely deserves a seat at that table, and that's why I placed it this high up with those games I just mentioned. With the disaster that was Odyssey's removal of them entirely, Valhalla not only brought them back, but followed Assassin's Creed Origins' idea of going fully cinematic, instead of sticking to the older White Room format. The story-driven ones in particular were brilliantly crafted. I loved how these memory corridors gave each member some time to talk about their stories before they died. And then to elevate them even more, the Eivor-Odin exchanges were such a clever addition too. Odin's constant whispering, urging Eivor to take a certain path or embrace a darker choice, only for Eivor to push back, made each scene feel interesting to witness. Now yes, not every confession had the same production value, and giving every Order and Zealot a corridor scene arguably diluted the impact, but the highs such as Kjotve the Cruel's, Fulke's, the Arrows and a few others was quite memorable. It's a shame these memory corridors don't get talked about that often, but instead get overshadowed by how bloated and long the story is. I think if this game shortened its story length and cut the bloat, it would be praised so much more, even by me. Assassin's Creed 3's memory corridors are bright, and that's not an exaggeration. They are literally full-on flashbang white. The first time one appears, you almost have to squint just to take it in, especially if you're somebody that plays video games in the dark. But if you can get past the blinding brightness, there is a lot to like here. For one, the characters Connor assassinates throughout the game are some of the most memorable in the series, and the speeches they give during these corridors are also quite memorable. Now, unlike a lot of enemies that we take out in recent games that also have memory corridors, so I'm mostly talking about Valhalla, I think almost every character Connor takes out has some sort of interesting motive and a great speech altogether, so their final words are actually pretty interesting to listen to. Now, in terms of visuals, the memory corridor is a standout. Instead of a solid platform, you get triangular tiles that float and break apart. Sometimes they reform under you, and other times they scatter more dramatically, especially in the loading screen when you're walking around with Connor. It's also interesting to note that if you happen to catch one of these tiles near the actual death confession scene playing out, you can see the reflection of what's happening inside the tile, so I thought that's pretty neat. I will say though, the removal of a memory corridor for Charles Lee out of all characters is interesting, because correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Charles Lee the only character in the game without a memory corridor? But to be honest, that makes a lot of sense. If you played the game, you'll know that what is currently there is a lot better than a memory corridor, so we can forgive them for that. So yeah, once you get past the flashbang factor, Assassin's Creed 3's memory corridors are easily some of the most memorable ones in the franchise. And now moving into the top 3. I've gone with 2 in 1 here because Assassin's Creed Black Flag and by extension Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry are pretty much identical in its memory corridors. But the memory corridors in Black Flag are easily some of the best in the entire series. And that's not really just because of how they look, although I will get onto that later. The real reason they shine is the targets themselves. Assassin's Creed Black Flag's characters are some of the strongest written in the franchise, and for that reason alone, it carries over into the death confession scenes. There is also an interesting twist here where, just like in Assassin's Creed 2, there are 2 targets that can appear in the same memory corridor even if you kill them separately. In Black Flag, I think it's John Cockram and Josiah Burgess sharing a scene this way, which adds a nice twist to how the Animus presents those memories. Now, in terms of how they look, the corridors themselves are stunning. They contain a kind of teal color that perfectly matches the pirate setting, but the real positive for me is the wave effect. You can see tiny light colored dots ripple and sway together, simulating the motion of the ocean. Hey, that rhymed. You know, it's a concept that Assassin's Creed Rogue would later use, but I think Black Flag does it even better because the movement feels a lot smoother and, I mean, it's more directly tied to the Caribbean waters. Freedom Cry keeps this exact same design and it works just as well there, even with its smaller size game. Now, before I move on, I do want to say, please Ubisoft, don't you dare screw up the memory corridors in the Black Flag remake. Matter of fact, just don't screw up the remake in general. Putting Assassin's Creed Origins in second place was not an easy call. I went back and forth between this and Assassin's Creed 1 for number 1. Origins completely reimagined what memory corridors could be, turning them from simple white voids into cinematic symbolic spaces that feel properly like they belong within Bayek's journey. Since 2007, we've seen memory corridors all follow a similar pattern, but Assassin's Creed Origins completely evolved it. It's why a game like Origins is so loved, because of how much effort is put into it. The death confession scenes in Origins are on another level. They're insanely well acted, they're beautifully written, and often just, loaded with symbolism tied to Egyptian mythology. I love the idea of that feather that Bayek has, and how he ends every conversation with it. I think it's supposed to resemble, connecting directly to the weighing of a soul against a feather in the afterlife. One major shout out goes to Abubakar Salim for delivering some of the most goosebump-worthy dialogue in Origins, and you can definitely notice it during his memory corridors. Even the echoes in when Bayek starts shouting, it's so noticeable, and just that little extra touch adds on to make these memory corridors so good. In fact, here's my hot take. Actually, it's probably not even a hot take at this point, but Abubakar Salim is the best voice actor the franchise has had, and yes, that means over Roger Craig Smith, who voiced Ezio. Make of that what you will. Now, in terms of appearance, Assassin's Creed Origins corridors are so stunning. I find it cool that the floor is just a shallow level of water going as far as possible until the fog hides it, and all the dark colors fit so well to create one of the best color combinations for a memory corridor in the series. I can appreciate how much effort went into this because even a side target like the Son of Ra had a memory corridor, and he's not even part of the main story. That's a side target, so it just shows you the effort they put into it. It's a shame about what came after with Odyssey, right? And at the number 1 spot, we have Assassin's Creed 1. Now, this game is exactly what I picture when I think memory corridor. It's the perfect combination of great atmosphere, great design, and just overall great storytelling. You know without a doubt that you're inside the Animus. I mean, look at it. There's a shit ton of code and digital text just floating in the air, constantly flickering in and out. It doesn't hesitate to let you know that you're inside a simulation. And it's a feeling that a lot of games kind of lost, let's be honest. That's why I think it needs to return in a memory corridor. Or you can just do what Origins and Valhalla did and focus on the acting side of it. That still works too. The color scheme, in my opinion, is quite spot on. It's not, blindingly bright like Assassin's Creed 3, but it's still very clean. The light blue tones mixed with cloudy, glitchy effects feel tailor-made for that early Animus look. And as for the targets themselves, I do think they are some of the better written ones we've had, and their death confessions actually build a story as you progress. I mean, that final memory corridor with Al-Mualim is the perfect payoff. Think about it, all that manipulation and betrayal culminated in watching him drop the apple. Now, whether that's nostalgia talking or not, it still hits hard. One of my favorite touches with the memory corridors in this game is how each target first appears on the ground, wounded in Altair's arms, before the scene changes and they're suddenly standing telling their story. For me, that's a very unique way of, combining their physical deaths with the symbolic conversation inside the Animus. Plus, there's that very cool Animus glitch where Desmond, who we know is inside the Animus reliving the memories of Altair, can actually change the camera angle mid-scene, letting you see the target moving like they're unharmed. That's a small thing, but it makes the corridor feel interactive, which we don't often see, and perhaps we never will see. Oh, and I guess there's even the Maria Thorpe failed death confession scene where Altair spares her, and instead of the normal emotional send-off, we get a completely different type of memory corridor moment. Again, I don't think we've ever seen anything like that. It's all of these things together, the glitchy Animus visuals, the color tone, the writing for each target, and those little strange moments I mentioned like Desmond changing camera angles that make Assassin's Creed 1's memory corridor still unmatched in my mind. It's the template I wish more games stuck to. So yeah, number one for me for sure. And there we have it. Let me know down below what your favorite game is in terms of memory corridors. I feel like it's probably between Valhalla, Origins, AC1 and Black Flag, because they all do it really well. Well, maybe not Assassin's Creed 1 in that same group, since that's the one that's locked in as my personal favorite. Here's to hoping Assassin's Creed Hexe brings memory corridors back. Since it's not being made by Ubisoft Quebec, who we know removed them entirely, there's at least a little hope. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.